So let me, though, start by asking both Jeff and Mike a question. You know, I mean, I think the question that I was asked to ask, you answered already. So let me ask you a different question, which is, you talked about how schools need to do this, but teachers shouldn't feel like everything is on their shoulders. So how do we do the advocacy to make schools the kind of wraparound community center, that doesn't really give it the justice, but the kind of center of community that you are envisioning? How do we do the advocacy, you know, around these cities and around these communities when, you know, we have, you know, people who are basically taking funding away from us and who are not giving schools the kind of community resonance that they should? Like, what would your suggestion be about how we get that done?
Well, I think the effort has to be a lot more localized and a lot more invested in our community. So I think our community has a lot of distrust, and rightfully so, of schools, right? And so that has to be earned back, and that's earned back, you know. Brian Stevenson, who's arguably the most successful death row lawyer in the United States, and for my money has the best analysis of race going right now in the country. He talks about proximity to pain, right? And if we're going to get real community buy-in, then folks have to get proximate to the pain. And that means like being in our communities after dark. That means being in our communities on the weekends and really building, it's base building is really what it is. And I think that a lot of the work that's been done around policy is either at district or state or national levels, and it doesn't mobilize the community. And if we don't mobilize the community to make these kind of demands on the system, then it's a lot bigger lift. Then we're literally engaging in ideological debate. And look, when you have an ideological debate with people that aren't moral, it always ends in a stalemate.
Right.
Right? So how do we, for me, it's about how do we, as a profession, how do we revisit those community roots, right? How do we address as a profession the fact that 86% of our profession is white and 84% of our profession is female, and boys of color are doing the worst in school, right? If we don't get our minds around that, right, and really begin to invest in developing some of these young people, right, to become the next generation of educators.
So you guys going to become teachers?
Yeah, I mean, she already got a nonprofit, right? And so I think we've been doing a lot of work in East Oakland around how do we build a pipeline, right, of educators from our community.
So you're thinking, and the reason I'm pushing on this is, so you're thinking we do things like grow your own programs. We also work with the HBCUs in terms of how we create much more diversity. And even as a teachers union, figure out if they're not going to get the money from Trump at all, figure out what do we do to invest in these kind of programs.
Yeah, I mean,
let me ask you another question. What do you think, and then I'm going to go to Mike, what do you think about home visit programs like the one that we're doing in Baltimore right now? Do you think that these, you know, or Duluth, do you think that that is part of trust building?
For sure. I think the more that, but home visits can also be toxic.
Right.
So if they're
Less
not done,
trained,
right?
Yeah.
If they're not done in a culturally and community responsive way, right? Then they're just took the trauma from the schoolhouse to the home, right? Yeah. So, you know, look, the story I tell is that I was recruited as an athlete, and I get calls from universities all over the country, their schools of ed, their deans, their presidents, and they're like, hey, you know, can you be a thought partner with us on how we can get more students of color into our school of ed? And we're talking about like some of the largest universities in the country, right? Folks that you would see on like ESPN, right? All the time. And I say to them, well, have you talked to your football and basketball coaches? And they incredulously, like, no, why would we talk? We don't just want athletes, Jeff. We want, and I was like, no, that's what I'm saying, because your football and basketball coaches don't seem to have a problem getting students of color. So you already have a model in-house, right? And the difference between you and your football and basketball coaches is the football and basketball coaches come do home visits, right? They come and spend time in our churches and in our lives and on our block and on our community because they see value in us being able to run fast and jump high for them, right? So if you want more biochemists and teachers and, right, then where is that same, there's a really good model already at the university for investing, but you got to invest early. They started recruiting me when I was in 5th grade, right? They started talking to, like, putting gear on me, telling me that I had value. I got summer visits to the university, right? But it was to play ball.
Right.
None of them, none of those universities ever talked to me about being a teacher. And it's a missed opportunity. Like, our community is ready, right, to engage in this challenge, but the pathway is always individualistic, right? There is no collective infrastructure to create this pipeline of young people to go into the profession, but there's a definite desire in our community to do so.
Great. So let's also start doing and thinking about how we can work together as a union to help enable that collective capacity.
For sure.
And I think, Mary Catherine's here with the Innovation Fund. I think that's one of the things that we should think about so that we don't take this amazingly great TED Talk you just did and that it just kind of stays in the ether with us. Let's figure out how we can do some of that work together.
Cool.
So let me ask you, my friend, it sounds like a really, okay, as I started saying it to myself, it sounded like a trite question. But I think I want to ask it because it seems so trite to us, but our districts see these things in different, containers. So when you think about the interaction of academics and social emotional learning, we know it's obviously not an either or, but how do we keep SEL from being another thing on the kind of ESSA accountability report card? Like, we were so, proud of ourselves that we actually got it on the accountability report card because we know if it's not on there, people are not going to do it. But how do we keep it, how do we make it real as opposed to it just being check the box?
Absolutely. Well, I think the first point that comes out of the research is that social, emotional, and academic learning are inextricably linked. They are completely tied together. And to go back to one of the slides that I was talking about with the parts of the brain, right? The amygdala taking over in moments of stress. The hippocampus, supposed to be in charge of learning and memory. If I were to tell you, okay, every kid in this classroom is now going to close their ears and close their eyes, and you're going to go teach a lesson, and then we're going to see what happens on the test afterwards, you would say, no way. But that's what we're doing when we don't understand the brain science. And this is what's so empowering about understanding what's going on inside the brain. If you understand that there's a part of the brain, if unbuffered by a trusting adult, if unbuffered, will shut down the part of the brain that's in charge of learning and memory, we know what's going to happen, right? I'll tell a story. I was sharing this with Jeff earlier. In one of our schools, we started off the partnership with 0% of staff reporting that they had faith in this leader. 0% at the beginning. In fact, he asked our program director to meet in our very first meeting on the playground because he believed...
Could you get any lower than 0%?
I'm not a mathematician, but no.
I'm teasing.
And so he asked us to meet on the playground for our first meeting because he was convinced that people were listening into his conversations. 26 suspensions per 100 kids in that school. And so we focused on this. We focused on social emotional learning. We focused on academics at the same time. Fast forward 2 years later, 73% reductions in suspensions, but that school also just had the highest median growth percentile in math in all of DCPS at that same school. So these are inextricably linked concepts. But if we don't have an equity-oriented approach to this, if we just think of equality, then we won't be actually giving schools, teachers, and leaders the resources and support that they need to actually overcome these challenges. And so that's why the word equity is so important today, not just equality. It's tuned into the needs that kids have and the resource implications that we need to respond with.
Great, thank you. So we have 2 questions that we've gotten from the app. And one, let me do the first one, and either one of you or both may want to answer. And this is about homeless kids. Recently in our district, it was revealed that over 2,700 students are homeless. What can we do to recognize these students and better accommodate and help them?
I think for me, the first part is actually recognizing that this is going on. Sometimes we like to, sweep some of these things under the carpet.
Right.
And the first part, when I think of the trauma-informed principles that have become part of what SAMHSA has put out there, the first one is actually understanding how widespread.
Everybody know what SAMHSA is? You want to just explain?
Sure. This is the side of the non-political side of HHS that has put out a bunch of principles about mental health, particularly in schools, and what you can do about it. So there's 4 main principles. The first one is actually understanding how widespread this is. So this is not something to be swept under the carpet. This is something to be recognized, to be aware of, for people to be talking about and reconciling. So the first element is understanding how widespread it is. The second part is understanding the signs and symptoms of what this actually shows up like in your classroom. Instead of thinking, oh, this behavior that I'm seeing must merit a suspension, can we think of it as a sign, a signal to dive deeper? One of the greatest tools that I've used in a classroom is a 2x10, very simple strategy. 2 minutes of uninterrupted time for 10 straight days with a child. We think of 2 minutes as being a very short amount of time, but 2 minutes of uninterrupted time where you're just connecting can be a really powerful tool. So these are the types of things that you can do if you understand how deep the level of challenge is.
Wow. And Jeff, can I ask you this question?
Sure.
Because I think people, people sometimes know what they know and they know what they don't know, but they don't know how to find a path to know what they don't know. And that's what I feel when I read a question like this, which is how can we as educators make sure every student feels like they fit in? And I think what the person is actually asking is what kind of skills and knowledge do we need to enable that? Not that we expect that of a child, but what can we do? And if we don't know how to do that, how do we find out how to do that?
Well, I think there's a couple clear pathways. One, in every school I'm in the country, there are teachers that are doing that, right? That have created that microclimate in their classroom, even in the most toxic schools I'm in, right? There's a teacher that has created that microclimate. And so when I'm working with teachers that are really looking to make that kind of pivot, right? That are doing that introspective work. The first thing I tell them is inevitably somebody in your building, right, is already doing that, and or somebody in the trajectory of your student's educational career has been doing that. So your best resource for almost every problem that you face as an educator is your students. So ask them, right? Literally, ask them anything. And they have tremendous insight into what works, why it works, how it works, when it works. And they can locate for you where that teacher is on your campus. This profession is so profoundly isolating. You start when the bell rings at 8 and it's click and it's you and 30, right? Let's go to work, right? Or go to war, depending on where you're at with them, right? And then it repeats itself, right, over the course of the day, and then 3:30 hits, and you're done. You're just trying to find the BAR, right? So you can gear up again for tomorrow, right? And that's part of what we have to end in our profession. We have to end the isolation, right? How do we create educational environments that are more collaborative? So that, because anything that a teacher's struggling with, there's somebody else in their building that struggled with it and unlocked it. right? But the way in which we organize the day, the way in which we organize teacher growth and teacher development is absurd, right? It's antiquated, and it's interruptive of teacher growth, right? So, you know, that would be my first suggestion, right? Is to ask kids where they've experienced that kind of classroom space. And the other thing I would say is, for the folks in this room that have an answer to that question, you have a moral obligation to reach out to your colleagues and start sharing what you know, right? Not in a pejorative way, not in a judgmental way, but in a way that's like, yo, I can help you, and I'm down to do that. I had one of my best mentor teachers when I first started teaching. His name's Herman Brown, dopest math educator in Oakland. And Herm's like 6'7", right? Big ass dude, right? And I started teaching when I was 20. And he pulls me to the side. He says, I got to tell you something. And I was like, all right. And he says, I don't think you really love these kids.
To you?
To me. And I'm like, yo, man, what are you talking about? Like I live in a neighborhood. I take kids home. He's like, yeah. You do all that. You do all that. But I have never once seen you support your colleagues. And I'm like, yeah, because I'm too busy, like, you know, doing the thing, Herm. I'm too busy helping the kids. And he says, if you really love these kids, you care what happens to them when they're not in your class, which means that you care about your colleagues. Right? Wow. And he helped me understand the difference between a good teacher and a great teacher. I think good teachers show up every day and kick ass in their class. I think great teachers show up every day and kick ass in their class, and they transform their school culture. Right? So I want to see, right, how do we take struggling teachers to good, and how do we take good teachers to great?
And how do we do it as a community and a profession where we're actually really sharing and finding the best in people?
That's right.
Which actually leads me to what will probably be our last question. I know there are others, but I think that this is, well, I'll just ask the question, and I think it's obvious why I would pick this one. So, how do we help our colleagues feel more willing to engage in difficult conversations? Conversations that pertain to race, gender, sexuality, poverty, the issues that have always seemed to be taboo, and that people are either they feel stymied by, they don't have the words, they feel immobilized. How do we help have those conversations? How do we start it?
I think for me, the one thing that sticks out the most is that we need to do more listening. There's far too many people who look like me in education doing all the talking. And so for me, the first thing that I would say is we need to actually listen to each other more and be aware of the voices that might actually already be there that are the powerful ones that you need. I'm reminded over and over again in conversations about how many solutions are coming from the kids themselves, the communities themselves. But if we're always the ones talking, there won't be any space for those folks. So I think listening, especially for people who look like me, is the most important thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think we need to lead with questions instead of statements. And we need to create the space for those kind of conversations. I mean, the truth is that this nation has such a nascent understanding and conversation about race and about patriarchy and about heteronormativity and about classism, that's what we see reflected back in the way in which we teach or don't teach about those things in our schools. And if educators are not given both the space and the infrastructure to begin to have those conversations, not in a one-off PD. It's like, I'm the trauma dude, right? I come in and like, now you're trauma informed, okay? Everybody's ready to go like solve the trauma, right? Instead of understanding, like we've had a radically unequal society since jump. You know, this is the only industrialized society in the world that has committed 2 genocides, right? And so this idea that we're gonna have like an ethnic studies class and it's gonna be all good, right? Or
in a minute.
Right, or a culturally relevant PD, and now you're set, right? Is absurd. Like we've built this radicalized inequality for 2+ centuries. So we're gonna need to be committed in the long game. And committed in the long game means that when you do that listening and you're literally feeling like shit, like damn, right? That you come back again and you come back again. And that when you come back, I'm holding your hand. You know what I'm saying? Like if we don't model that for our young people, what we keep modeling for our young people is this up by your bootstraps individuality of like, you figure that out, right? You figure that out, instead of a real collective commitment to one another. And I see it in schools, in the spaces where I watch teachers walk by each other and hug and dap, right? And acknowledge humanity. I see the kids doing it. And in the places, in the schools that I'm in, where teachers blow right past each other and don't say a word, right? I watch kids do it, right? So the question isn't whether or not kids are down to have these conversations. The question is whether or not grown-ups are down to have these conversations. Are we down to get really, really uncomfortable and then support each other through the discomfort? Because the meaning is in the mess. And we keep trying to sanitize these conversations. And the truth is that if we're going to talk honestly about white supremacy and male supremacy and hetero supremacy and class supremacy, it's going to be messy. And I'm down for the mess.
So let me ask the audience, are you down for the mess? So look, this is just touching this area. And I know we're having boot camps that, where people are developing the muscle around how to advocate for, think about, embed children's well-being as part and parcel of what public education is about. But I just want to thank our 2 amazing panelists, as well as the other presenters that were here. And I want to just say to everybody here, I hope it's been a meaningful day. And I hope you find that the rest of Teach, I want you to have fun. I'm going to be everybody's Jewish mother. This is Washington, D.C. It is a swamp. Drink a lot of water. Don't just go out drinking, and don't drink and drive, but don't go out drinking without drinking a lot of water here. And there are a lot of things. My mother would be so proud of me that I just said that. There's a lot of exciting things that are waiting for us just outside this room. The expo, I have to do these advertisements, sorry. The expo area right now, there's the Share My Lesson reception tonight. I think that's probably in 2 or 3 or 4 minutes. And we'll see you back in this room tomorrow morning at 10:45, and the boot camps start at 8:30. But let me just say, it is so great to see over 1,400 educators from around the nation, at many times their own expense, take this time this summer to actually learn our craft in this kind of collective way, and a way that we're doing this work together. And I salute you, and have a great, 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 great night. Thanks, everybody.